The town of Hollow Creek was shrouded in an eerie silence. The wind whistled through the trees, their branches swaying like skeletal fingers. Fog clung to the ground, a thick white blanket. The air was heavy with a sense of dread. 20-year-old Ethan lived alone in a creaky Victorian house on the edge of town. He was a solitary figure, drawn to the quiet mystery of Hollow Creek. He spent his days exploring the town's antique shops, fascinated by the relics of the past. One chilly afternoon, as Ethan wandered down Main Street, his eyes fell upon a peculiar antique shop he had never noticed before. Its sign was barely visible, the letters faded and peeling. Intrigued, he decided to venture inside. The antique shop was dark and dusty, the air thick with the smell of decay. Ethan coughed, his eyes struggling to adjust to the dim light. Cobwebs hung from every corner, and the shelves were crammed with strange and forgotten objects. Ethan ran his fingers over a chipped porcelain doll, its painted eyes seeming to follow him. He picked up a tarnished silver locket, its inscription worn away by time. As he moved deeper into the shop, he felt a cold shiver run down his spine. In the center of the shop, encased in glass, was a porcelain doll. It was unlike any doll Ethan had ever seen. Its eyes were wide and vacant, its painted smile a grotesque mockery of joy. The doll was dressed in a faded white dress, its porcelain skin cracked and yellowed with age. Ethan was drawn to the doll, mesmerized by its unsettling beauty. He asked the shopkeeper, a stooped old man with cloudy eyes, about its history. The shopkeeper hesitated, his gaze flickering nervously towards the doll. "Her name is Annabelle," the shopkeeper whispered, his voice raspy with age. "A collector's item. But be warned, she's not for the faint of heart." Ethan dismissed the shopkeeper's words as superstitious nonsense. He paid for the doll, eager to add it to his collection of oddities. As Ethan carried Annabelle home, he couldn't shake off the feeling that he was being watched. The doll felt strangely heavy in his arms, its porcelain skin cold to the touch. He tried to ignore the unsettling feeling, convincing himself it was just his imagination. Upon arriving home, Ethan placed Annabelle on a shelf in his study. He sat down at his desk, his back to the doll. He tried to focus on his work, but he couldn't shake off the feeling of unease that had settled over him. He kept hearing faint noises, soft whispers that seemed to come from the direction of the shelf where Annabelle sat. He would turn around, but the doll remained motionless, its vacant eyes staring into nothingness. As the days turned into nights, the strange occurrences in Ethan's house intensified. He would wake in the dead of night to the sound of footsteps creaking on the stairs, slow and deliberate. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. Ethan started seeing shadows moving in the corners of his vision, fleeting glimpses of something dark and sinister. He tried to rationalize these events, but a growing sense of dread gnawed at his sanity. One evening, as Ethan sat reading in his study, he felt a cold breath on his neck. He spun around to find Annabelle had moved. The doll, which he had left on the shelf across the room, was now sitting on the edge of his desk, its vacant eyes staring directly at him. Ethan tried to convince himself that he had simply forgotten where he had placed the doll, but deep down, he knew something was terribly wrong. The doll had moved. It had moved on its own. Section 5. The Grip of Fear. Supernatural events intensify. Panic began to consume Ethan. The strange occurrences in his house escalated from whispers and shadows to physical manifestations. Objects would fly across the room with terrifying force. Doors would slam shut on their own. The once comforting silence of his home was now filled with unseen terror. He tried to get rid of Annabelle, throwing her in the garbage, even leaving her at a nearby church. But she always found her way back, appearing in his house as if nothing had happened. Her presence was inescapable, a constant reminder of the evil that had invaded his life. One night, Ethan woke up to find Annabelle hovering above him. Her eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and her porcelain face was contorted in a grotesque mockery of a smile. He felt paralyzed with fear, unable to move or scream as the doll leaned closer, whispering chilling threats into his ear. Ethan knew he was no longer dealing with mere hauntings. This was something far more sinister, something that fed on his terror and thrived in the darkness that had enveloped his life. Desperate for answers, Ethan delved into the history of the antique shop and the origins of the doll. He discovered that the shop had once been owned by a woman known for practicing dark magic. It was said that she had imbued the doll with a malevolent entity, a demon seeking to cross over into the human world. Ethan learned that Annabelle was not merely haunted, but a conduit, a vessel for something ancient and evil. He realized with chilling clarity that he hadn't brought home a haunted doll. He had given a malevolent entity a key to his world. Fueled by this terrifying discovery, Ethan sought help from the town librarian, an elderly woman rumored to be knowledgeable in the supernatural. She listened to his story, her eyes filled with a mixture of pity and fear. "The entity within the doll feeds on fear," the librarian warned, her voice trembling. "The more you fear it, the stronger it becomes." She gave him an old book, its pages filled with rituals and incantations, and a glimmer of hope sparked within him. Armed with newfound knowledge, Ethan tried to perform the rituals, hoping to banish the entity back to the darkness from whence it came. But each attempt was met with violent resistance. The house shook, objects flew across the room with impossible force, and Annabelle's haunting laughter echoed through the halls. He found himself trapped in a terrifying game of cat and mouse with an entity he couldn't see, fighting against a force far older and more powerful than he could have ever imagined. The line between reality and nightmare blurred, and Ethan's grip on sanity began to slip. One night, as the entity's power reached its peak, Ethan looked into the contorted face of Annabelle and saw not a doll, but a reflection of his own terror. He realized with a sickening certainty that the entity had latched onto his deepest fear, amplifying it, feeding on it until it consumed him entirely. Driven to the brink of madness, Ethan made a desperate decision. He gathered all his courage and fled his home, leaving behind everything he owned, including the cursed doll. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs ached, seeking refuge in the anonymity of the outside world. He found shelter in a bustling city, miles away from the eerie quiet of Hollow Creek. He tried to rebuild his life, haunted by the memories of his encounter with the entity. He sought therapy, trying to convince himself that it was all in his head, a figment of his imagination. One evening, while walking through a crowded market, he noticed a familiar antique shop tucked away in a dark corner. Drawn by an unseen force, he entered the shop, his heart pounding in his chest. There, displayed prominently in a glass case, was Annabelle. Her vacant eyes seemed to follow him, her painted smile as chilling as he remembered. But something was different. The shopkeeper, a young woman with a knowing smile, approached him. "She's been waiting for you," the woman said, her voice raspy and ancient. "She told me you would come." Ethan stumbled back in horror as he realized the terrifying truth. Annabelle hadn't just followed him, she had led him here, her influence stretching far beyond the confines of his former home. The entity was not bound to the doll. It was bound to him. It would follow him wherever he went, its terror a constant shadow in his life. Ethan was trapped, forever bound to the terrifying legacy of Annabelle. The doll's reign of terror continued.